Okay. Answered my question there. Very good. Good morning.
Good morning.
We welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Niagara on this Sunday, November the 6th. And we begin with our opening words. What is required? How shall I enter the eternal presence? Shall I come with sacrifices, with yearling calves to offer? Would the eternal care for rams in thousands, or for oil flowing in myriad streams? What does the eternal ask from you? To be just and kind and live in quiet fellowship with your God. You'll turn in your program to our chalice lighting. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom. If you'll turn in your hymnal to hymn number 346, and those of you who are able and or inclined, if you'll rise and sing with us, Come Sing a Song with Me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I may know you're mine. I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in winter time.
I'm trying to get you to sing out all on your own. I'm sorry. I hear Teresa.
Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find, and I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time. Thank you. Please be seated. We are not the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. However, we have charms of our own. If you'll turn in your hymnal to the responsive reading, which this Sunday is number 586, written by President Abraham Lincoln. It's entitled "The Idea of Democracy." As labor is the common burden of our race, so the effort of some to shift their share of the burden onto the shoulders of others is the great durable curse of the race. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Destroy this spirit, and we have planted the seeds of despotism at our own doors. Why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? Thank you. That responsive reading, if you haven't gleaned it as yet, was chosen in deep respect and deep commitment to the democracy of not only this great nation, but the democracies that are striving to manifest themselves throughout the world. And remembering that, of course, this coming Tuesday is in this nation, our midterm elections. And to wit, we are all responsible for the kind of government we have. So we thank you for that reflection. We come to the point of our service now, joys and sorrows. I light this candle and the spirit of concern. And that, of course, is throughout the troubled world in which we live. Again, I mentioned that this Tuesday in our country, we are called upon, each and every one of us, to defend democracy to the utmost through the ballot box. Also, of course, we are still deeply concerned and send our positive intentions and our affirmations to those wonderful people in Ukraine who are still suffering the onslaught of war. And November is Indigenous Peoples Month, and it is our opportunity to reflect upon what we as a nation in the past have done to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and an opportunity to reflect and make a commitment that we shall not repeat the sins, if you will, of the past, but indeed strive to make amends and to build a more constructive brotherhood and sisterhood with all peoples. If anyone else would like to come up and share a joy or a sorrow. We now come to that portion of our service referred to as the offering. And as the offertory is being played, you'll now turn to Spirit of Life. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Thank you. I've had opportunity to recently do a lot of reflecting, and well, actually, we ministerial types, that sometimes my wife tells me that's all we do is sit and reflect, but that's a whole nother story. In any event, one of the things that, of course, spurred me to a reflection, I had occasion to witness a young child, maybe 3 years old, ask her mother, "Mommy, where is heaven?" And I watched Mom, who was very liberal. I use that term not advisedly. She was, her entire orientation is progressive. Her entire orientation is born in science and is a true, what I will call humanist, if you will. And I saw her squiggle and squirm and stutter and spurt and not answer this child's questions at all. And it led me to consider, I said, I can remember in studying, and over the past, I would say easily 10, maybe even 12 years, the history, excuse me, of the Unitarians and the history of the Universalists. And I think sometimes we do forget that over the past 30 some years, as we have evolved and progressed and cobbled together a denomination, the uncommon denomination, I might add, as it's been referred to. But previous to that, we were, for lack of a better choice of words, a so-called Christian denomination. It's one of the things that was the hallmark of our heresy, the heresy of the Unitarians and the heresy of the Universalists. And of course, those beliefs are in the rejection of the concept of Trinity, the acceptance of a universal, if you will, salvation. So as was in the Christian tradition, and in probably almost every other tradition, save perhaps, let's say, Buddhism, there was an emphasis on a life after death. Now, one of the things that I love about being what I call a spiritual humanist is that I am not married, I am not bound, and I'm, as I refer to myself, I'm spiritually fluid. I am not bound to a belief system to the extent, or any belief system to the extent that it makes me frozen in my tracks, my spiritual tracks, or my my outward expression. Because a lot of people within a lot of religious traditions do teach about an afterlife. They do teach very specific theological and, for lack of a better term, dogmatic, creedalistic, this is what it is, and you can't possibly disagree with this because we know. How they know, I don't know, but they claim to know. And so I think what happens to the humanist is they understand that this is basically a battle of so-called good and so-called evil. And the teaching of an afterlife, the teaching of what happens after, and we call it the change. Please remember I said that, the change called death, is that there is a very dynamic emphasis on who gets to go to heaven, a place of peace and joy and growth and progression, and who gets to go to hell, which is basically described in such ways that the average French fry would shudder. And of course, this is taught for generation after generation after generation. And remember, well, you probably, maybe you remember, I'd like to think that I'm sometimes quoted, but I'm very seldom quoted. I'd like to believe that, but no. You've heard me say that poor psychology, pardon me. I'm saying it backwards. Poor theology makes very poor psychology. If I teach you somehow that you are less than, you will begin to behave as you are less than. If I teach you to anticipate God or even a so-called afterlife in the context of fear and dread, you will behave in the context of fear and dread. And so it was not, in my opinion, if I may say so, it was not a mistake for this uncommon denomination to begin to veer away from such beliefs and such teachings and such dogma and creed, and to focus on what has become our prime directive in the Unitarian Universalist movement, attaining an ideal of spirituality by virtue of seeking justice. And of course, anyone who understands spirituality understands that it is basically a synonym for peace. But we also know through studying history and theology that without justice, there can be no peace. So we are focused on the here and the now. We are not focused on the struggle of so-called good and evil, save the struggle that appears in our three-dimensional, our physical existence. And yet I tell you, it is important, at least in my opinion, not to go back to the old theology or to the old beliefs or studying religious systems that, for example, make you feel bad about yourself, make you full of fear, make you full of dread. But it is important, in my opinion, from a psychological and spiritual point of view, that we are able to acknowledge that there are things we don't understand, there are things we don't know, and we see, as Paul says, through the glass darkly. Meaning, we all have our ideas, our impressions, and that's the beautiful thing about the uncommon religion, the uncommon denomination. Your guess is as good as mine, is that we need to, I think, be a little bit more inclined to talk about death, but not just within a humanistic sense. All too often when I deal with humanists, and whether they be Unitarian, Universalist humanists, or agnostics, or atheists, or anybody in between, more often than not, they have spent so much time denying anything other than the age of reason context, that if it isn't in the five senses, it can't possibly exist. Then what happens though is their psychology is such where ironically they still have high anxiety about death. Now, there's two old expressions that are in a way amusing in a sense, but also very true. One, there are no atheists in foxholes. And actually, everybody wants to go to heaven as a concept. Nobody wants to die. So what we are more afraid of than eternal perdition, eternal punishment, or some kind of craziness that is beyond human comprehension, we're not as much afraid of that, I think, as we are of the physiology of what are we going to go through in that process. As we get older, we get more mature about it. We understand that it is a fact of life. And those of us who are pragmatists, those of us who are realists, accept it. And yet I go back and say to you, is there a way to become more emotionally or psychologically settled about the issue without having to, again, go back to feeling bad about yourself or experiencing any kind of fear or dread? And I must tell you that the interest in so-called life after death has never really waned. Job in the Old Testament said, if a man dies, does he live again? And so the concept of something beyond is a worthy, has been and will continue to be until, as they say, the last of us is still here, a worthy query to ask of self and whatever our concept of a higher power, a God, or whatever term you want to use. Again, for the purpose of some comfort, but also for the psychological restoration of some frame of balance. Because when I talk to people who do not have that frame of balance, who have just cut it off at the knees, who don't want to talk about it, I ask them, I said, you seem particularly agitated when I bring up the subject. And that's why I've often said this over the last 40 years. We can talk about the most intimate details of human sexuality in mixed company. Bring up the subject of death and dying. Bring up the subject of your own mortality and how you feel about it, etc. And I will be able to get a tape measure and measure 10 feet of distance between you and anybody in that room. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. I did this one time when I was a very young man. I'm ashamed of it. Not. A young lady came up to me and of course, at that time I was very involved in, I am, by the way, you should know this about me. And I hope that when I tell you this, you'll continue to invite me back, but you might not. I am a paranormal investigator. I am. I study psychic phenomena, have for 40 years. I was an ordained spiritualist minister for 12 years. So you need to know that. But this young lady came up to me and she said, hi, what's your name? Oh, my name's Ron. What do you do? And, we're not human beings, as Dr. Wayne Dyer said, we're human doings. It's the first question people ask, what do you do? Oh, I talk to the dead. I never saw her the rest of that evening. I wasn't being all that serious. I said it with a smile on my face and a song in my heart. But again, it showed me one interesting thing. Our belief in what comes after, if something does come after, is very squarely framed by, again, a lot of that fear a lot of the demonology and bad theology that forms the bad psychology. And we do it subconsciously or unconsciously. And so it doesn't really, in a nutshell, surprise me that people, even in the most age of reason point of view, still avoid it, because I think psychologically there is a part of them that either still believes or would like to believe, but because of what they've been taught, or just kind of through osmosis, a kind of a psychological osmosis, has absorbed enough negativity that they, it's I'd rather not talk about it. Let's talk about the weather, the price of gasoline. No, I think people would rather talk about death than the price of gasoline. But anyway, but you get my point. Now, and of course, we just celebrated Halloween, where, and I say this, of course, tongue in cheek, everybody on planet Earth on Halloween suddenly begins to believe in ghosts. And that passes. And yet, I remember in my studies of spiritualism that back from March 31st, 1848, when they call that the beginning of modern spiritualism, the interest in paranormal phenomena, the interest in so-called mediumship, psychic ability, the ability to be far more than just our five senses, exploded. Now, there's some very sociological reasons for that. One of them, just as I may mention, was the fact that people were living way shorter than they are now. So the idea of death approaching quickly could happen to you at 30, not at 70, okay? But let's ignore that for a minute. You had hundreds of thousands, if not a couple of million people who were suddenly engaged. The irony of it all is that at the same time, there were, as is in the development of all, may I say the word again, all theology, there was the development of all these ideas and notions about what the afterlife was like, how, our response to so-called death and so forth. And it was fascinating. It still is fascinating. In 1903, but because, and I have to say this in all candor, because they also, one of the reasons spiritualism came into existence at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was to stem the tide of the rampant materialism, the capitalist materialism that was beginning to sweep over this nation and the world. They failed miserably. And they failed miserably because they unconsciously got involved in, I'll use the term, a lot of fraud. So for every investigator that went out and said, oh my God, and people like Sir William Crookes, the inventor of the vacuum tube, who made the modern X-ray possible, who became an ardent, staunch spiritualist, there were people like Harry Houdini, who came out and said, most of this is junk. I don't have any idea how people do this. And then he made a very big mistake. He called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course wrote Sherlock Holmes, and gave all that up to become a spiritualist proponent. Houdini called his wife a fraud, which is why it was very appropriate for Houdini to carry a handgun with him, because there were people who literally wanted his life for making that horrible judgment against Mrs. Doyle. But the point was, there was a ridiculous amount of information, and it was sifted through, continues to be sifted through. And because of that, some of that fraud and some of that failure to be more spiritually oriented than oriented to just the so-called, I'll use the term loosely, it's not empirical, the science of metaphysics, or the science of psychic ability, interest in it began to wax and wane. And yet, ironically enough, people did not go to a higher, more nobler view of what might come after the change called death. They went back to the old theology, and now you see people in mega churches still praying for a peaceful death and praying that they don't fry in hell eternally and that some God of some sort has mercy upon their soul. You would, and so you have what I call peaks and valleys of interest. Now, of course, there's a huge interest because people like his last name, I believe, is I'm sorry, gentleman John Edwards, Teresa Caputo, the Long Island medium. You see a lot of this on television. And I'll be the first to admit to you before, in all candor, sometimes some of that stuff makes me awe-inspired, and a lot of times it makes me scratch my head going, I can't stretch my credulity into infinity. I just can't, okay? But spirits are here. I got dead guys, you got, no, anyway. All right, I'm a card, what can I say? But in 1968, the interest in communing with the so-called other side suddenly, exploded. And I remember those days. I was very young. I didn't really start getting involved till about 1970, maybe 70, I'm sorry, 1972. But what eventually pulled me away was the dichotomy. I was spending so much time shifting through what I called erroneous information that was stretching my credulity into infinity, that I respectfully and yet of necessity pulled back, because I came to one interesting conclusion. If I can, I used to say this, my God, when I was 25 years old, if I can prove to you through this phenomenon of psychic phenomenon that you are a spiritual being who is having a human experience, and that once the change called death occurs, you will go on to go and grow and be loved and progress, etc. That's not, by the way, also taking into consideration the millions of people who believe in reincarnation, but that's a subject for another sermon. If I can prove to you that's the case, and prove to you in such a way that you cannot doubt it in your own heart, in your own mentality, in your own, may I use the word, soul, you will become a moral, ethical, wonderful person, right? Absolutely not. Just like you can't scare a drug addict straight. You can't say, if you continue this lifestyle, you're going to have all kinds of physiological problems. You're going to end up in a hospital, in jail, or dead. You can't scare that person. So the belief that there is something beyond that it is in your inherent righteous best self-interest to not necessarily accept wholeheartedly, but at least somewhat wholeheartedly, so that you can not only prepare for that experience, but indeed live a more sane and safe life here. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. Humanity is a tough sell. It's a tough sell for, and if you doubt that, you can ask a fellow like Jesus or a fellow like Buddha. The messages keep coming out. Like it said in the opening words today. Be kind. Make loving kindness your your philosophy, make loving kindness your religion. That's all you need to do in this life. And yet people continue to ignore that. Now, what it did, though, teach me before I left was that the information, the positive information that was coming through from those whom the world called dead was of a quality and a nature that was light years ahead of its time. It was through the spiritualists that they indeed believed that men and women were co-equals. It was through the spiritualists that they believed in the abolition of slavery, that you have no right to own another human being, et cetera, et cetera. When the other denominations of the Christian faith, most of them were weak-kneed and not responsive to the seeking of that justice at the time. Susan B. Anthony spoke at Lilydale Assembly in 1891 for the first time, and she spoke to 3,000 people there because they accepted her with open arms because their theology and philosophy was liberalized, open-ended, born of love, not of fear. So there was a potential there to do some great things. Some great things were done. And then again, like with anything else, there came a time of where that flowed by the river, down the river. And now we have, again, the kind of environment where a lot of people are running around attending psychic fairs so that people can see all, know all, tell all, give me $200. And that is something that I've always found anathematic, and therefore that's why I'm here. So, however, I will share with you that one of the best ways that I have found to mitigate my own personal grief and is to help other people and others' grief when they're dealing with someone who has made their transition is reminding them that each and every one of us has unique sensitivities beyond our five senses, that many times we call that our imagination. So in the spirit of what I'm sharing with you, I'll share with you what I will call one true ghost story. Years ago, when I was 24, 25, my parents lived across the street from Irene and Steve Kowalski. Irene and Steve were wonderful, hardworking, God-loving Americans. And, they did everything right and so forth, married for half a century. And one day they went out on to a wedding that they had been invited to. And Steve had that I understand to this day was a massive heart attack and died on the dance room floor. Steve was very light on his feet. He was a stepper. So for him to pass away like that was kind of a good thing. He passed away the way he would have liked to. I do believe that. What she related to me, but she came to me after the funeral, and these are people who, poo-pooed the idea of studying matters of the soul, poo-pooed the idea of studying matters of psychic ability, et cetera. And she says, I've got to talk to you. And I'm thinking, oh, here it comes. Why don't you come back to the Catholic Church, the one true faith? You've broken your mother's heart. You get the idea. But no, she said, you're not going to believe anything I'm going to tell you, but please, this happened to me. Take it for what it's worth. When I was dancing with Steve on the floor, all of a sudden he became literally as light as a feather. I go, you mean your strength came on you when he began to fall? She says, no, Ron. It was like he was a feather. I said, okay, that, I can't speak to that. Excuse me. It says, but a few weeks after he'd passed away, now you have to understand two things about Steve. Very methodical man, very precise, did everything according to a schedule. So every morning he would get up. First thing he did was light his 22-cent cigar. And Jesus, it was a 22-cent cigar. light that sucker up, walk past the bedroom where Irene slept, puffing away at the cigar, fire up the coffee pot, and then went back and opened his newspaper till she got up to have her coffee because he'd retired before she did. So she was getting ready to go to work. She says, on some mornings, I can smell the cigar passing my room. I go, Irene, that's a 22-cent cigar. It's going to stick in the house for 6,000 years. She goes, no. He goes, I'm very clean. The house was, it was that cigar smoke. I said, okay. And she says, and then I'm smelling coffee brewing. I said, Irene, you could have brewed some coffee and forgot about it. I do it sometimes. She says, Ron, I don't have any coffee in the house since Steve died. I said, oh. And she says, and then I had this interesting dream. Now it says in scripture, your young men will see visions, your old men shall see dreams. So I take it in that spirit. She said, I dreamt that I was on this grassy knoll. And here's the verbiage that people who've had near-death experiences always use, or mostly use. I cannot describe to you the beauty of where I was. It was awe-inspiring, stunning colors. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Says if I could describe heaven, this would be it. I said, okay. She said, I'm sitting and Steve is coming up the hill, dressed like he was getting ready to go to church on Sunday, had a beautiful head of hair. Steve was like a billiard ball before he passed away. Had a beautiful head of hair, looked like he was in his prime. And he said to Irene, he said, I love you. I'm always with you. And by the way, I will wait for you. And she said, I cried in the dream and I woke up crying, but I've never felt so much better. Now, I've got to tell you, folks, whether that was a real phenomenon, an actual psychic experience, or whether it was just a psychological, expression or experience, she felt better. She did not feel less than, she did not feel in any way negative, and she had hope. And that's the thing, hope of some form of reconciliation. Well, I must tell you that if you're interested in pursuing this subject, which you may or may not be, I bring it to you in the context of, I'll use the phrase spiritual information, but I would encourage you to do what I would consider a humanist approach to the subject. First, I would give you serious pause to read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, it was published in 1969 and it's been in continuous publication ever since, on death and dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And then she wrote another book on life after death in 1991, and The Tunnel and the Light in 1999. Another great investigator, but this is more in the context of not, hers would be more philosophical because she interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and their opinions and their experience pre their death. Another fellow is Dr. Raymond Moody. And in 1975, he wrote a book called Life After Life. He was an agnostic, he was a skeptic, but his research was in the near-death experience. Now, people are on very opposite ends of the pole. Some people experience these things and it's life-changing, or they share it with people and it's life-changing to them. Other people think it's a psychological aberration, means nothing. I'm not here to argue the point. I am here to encourage you that if you really want to get to know the subject better in a very, I think, holistic and in as close to a scientific process as possible, Dr. Raymond Moody would be it. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neuroscientist, by the way, who was in a medically induced coma, wrote a book called Proof of Heaven. And finally, Dr. Mary Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, wrote To Heaven and Back. She was pinned under her kayak and died when she went over a waterfall and was brought back through modern medicine and has proceeded to give a absolute cornucopia of information as to what she perceives was her reality after she had died. And there is an excellent website, and it's simply called Life After Life. So I bring you this information again to those of you who have experienced loss, those of you who perhaps have struggled with this issue for as long as perhaps you can remember, as I have. I have found that working it through has, I believe, made me a better person and better able to deal with the grief and the struggle of other people. If I were to tell you that you're flying to California tomorrow and you've never been to California, what would be the first thing you'd want to do? Well, first you'd ask me, Ron, do I need a warm coat? Do I need this? Do I need that? Then you'd probably go to the library, or maybe you have it in your home, and find a book on California to figure out what it might be like, so you don't have any surprises. You've heard the expression, forewarned is forearmed. Well, that's the purpose of my reflection today. Open your heart, open your mind, and perhaps investigate this a little bit more. It is my contention you will find greater peace, greater insight, and perhaps have a different point of view than perhaps you've had before, perhaps you have today. And I share that with you in the spirit of love, in the spirit of light. I bid you peace. Let's turn to hymn number 325 and sing it like we mean it. 325, Love Makes a Bridge.
Love makes a bridge from heart to heart and hand to hand. Love finds a way when laws are blind and freedom banned. I'm not hearing any. We don't know
Love
this.
break.
They don't know this one. I didn't either. That's why I thought we didn't. Do you want to try? Let's just try the last verse, and I'll just play the part. Why don't you just play the melody? Okay. Love makes a bridge
From heart to heart, hand to hand, love finds a way when laws are blind.
One more time.
Nah, that's not working.
I was going to get you.
Can we do Melancholy Baby? No. Can we do one of my favorites? Them bones, them. No, that's too much like the subject matter. Okay. Pick one, Maestro.
Huh? Oh,
Pick a hymn. Something everybody knows.
No, I don't think we know that one. I don't know. Somebody else picked. Nothing's coming up.
Nothing's coming.
What?
Perfect. You are my muse. It's my theme song. Okay.
Oops.
'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity gain to ashamed.
To
Turn
will be our delight,
till by turning, we come round right. Our never-ending struggle to come out right. Thank you. Please be seated. That's beautiful. Oh, you want to learn how to become real unpopular?
Yeah.
Preach that sermon. No.
No.
I was reflecting actually in a spiritualist church on the issue of the survival of the soul of animals. I have a lot of friends who are vegan. I have a lot of friends who are vegetarian. I've not been able to make that commitment, and I know it. I call it my greatest hypocrisy. However, I brought to the attention that many spiritualist writers and mediums of the day very strongly, which is why they fought diligently and still do for anti-vivisection laws, for example, like in Great Britain, and laws to protect animals from scientific experiments. But the point was that they believed that animals had souls, and that when you made your own, when you go through the change of death, not only will you meet your loved ones, your relatives and friends, you will meet your dog, your cat, etc. Beautiful sentiment. I said, but you know why I'm sure theologically it was rejected by most of Christendom from the very beginning? Because if you give an animal a soul, it makes it all that much more difficult to eat him. Yeah, I was real popular that day. I think I just slipped out the back door. So there you go. Story of my ministry. We have come to, before we get to our closing words and extinguishing our chalice, our announcements for the day. I think I've said enough. So if there's anyone that has any announcements to be made, now, as they say, is the time. Okay.
Going once, going twice.
Yeah, going twice. Sold to the lady in the blue hat. Yes. We do, of course, invite you to stay with us after the devotional service for refreshment. I do believe we have coffee. Yes, excellent. It's part of my contract. No coffee, no drive come. No. So very good. All right. So if you'll join me in this affirmation, in this intention, as we close our service before we extinguish our chalice. We've gathered together as brothers and sisters, united in body, in mind, and ultimately something we have very little understanding of, but in spirit. There's so much we know, and yet what we know helps us conclude infinitely how much we don't know. We pray in the true Unitarian Universalist sense, in a true Unitarian Universalist spirit, to keep our hearts and our minds wide open, to reject nothing, question everything, and open ourselves to truly seek freedom, liberty, understanding, and love. And that our prime directive, whether it be in the so-called here or the so-called hereafter, is ultimately seeking justice, which will manifest peace. So it is, and so we choose it to be. Amen. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
So in the spirit of Unitarianism, or however you call it,
Sure.
changing up words and music and such. And being within the spirit of today's topic, I chose to do 347 because you had mentioned it,
Oh,
but I have put the first part is the lyrics from Tommy Prophet. I first heard it last week on this show called Legacies. It's all about vampires and werewolves and witches and stuff.
I can't win. Okay.
And then the last part of it I did myself, the sing you to sleep thing.
Well, go right ahead.
Come on to me, I'll give you your rest, gardens of sweet violets. Eat until your soul is content. Come on to me, I'll give you your rest. Sing you to sleep, eternal rest. Whispering angels will wake you soon, gliding through starlight on past the moon. Dance, dancing spirit, I'll see you soon. I actually wrote for Penny, my little doggie. I know she's in heaven. Jesus.
Go in peace.